For most people, a visit to a cemetery is a quiet and private moment. It usually marks a day of remembrance, a family tradition, or a chance to pay respects to someone who is gone. But sometimes, a visit to a graveyard raises more questions than it answers. That is exactly what happened when reports and online discussions began focusing on Annie Guthrie's presence at a cemetery, while questions surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance continued to circulate. Then journalist Brian Entin publicly discussed the subject, asking whether there was more to understand about the timing, the circumstances, and what investigators already knew. His comments did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Instead, they reflected the same questions many people had already been asking. Why was Annie there? Was the visit connected to the investigation? Or was it simply a personal moment that became part of a much larger story? Those questions have fueled countless conversations. Some are based on verified information. Others are built entirely on speculation. Separating the two is where this story begins. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has remained the center of public attention for a long time. Every photograph, every interview, every reported sighting, and every official statement has been examined repeatedly. Families, neighbors, reporters, and viewers have all tried to understand what happened. Like many missing person cases that received national attention, the story developed in stages. At first, the focus stayed on finding answers as quickly as possible. As days passed, investigators gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and searched locations that they believed could provide useful information. Search teams reportedly worked through difficult terrain. Volunteers joined organized efforts. Community members waited for updates that often arrived slowly. Records show that investigators remained careful about releasing information publicly. That is common in active investigations, particularly when detectives believe that certain details could affect future interviews or possible court proceedings. For the public, however, silence often creates room for theories. People naturally try to fill gaps with explanations. Some theories disappear quickly. Others remain for months or even years. That brings us to Annie Guthrie. Throughout the investigation, Annie's name appeared frequently because of her connection to Nancy and because of her own public appearances during various stages of the case. Depending on the report, she was described differently by different media outlets, but her actions continued attracting attention. Most of those moments were ordinary. Some became controversial only because they occurred while emotions surrounding the case remained high. One of those moments involved a visit to a cemetery. At first, that seemed straightforward. People visit cemeteries for countless reasons. They may attend a funeral. They may honor a loved one. They may visit a family member's grave. Or they may simply need a quiet place to think. None of those actions automatically suggest involvement in an investigation. Even so, the timing prompted discussion. Observers noticed that the visit happened while public attention surrounding Nancy's disappearance remained intense. Before long, photographs and online posts began circulating. Some viewers believed the visit carried special meaning. Others argued there was no evidence supporting that conclusion. According to publicly available reporting, no official investigative agency announced that Annie's presence at the cemetery represented evidence of criminal activity. Authorities also did not publicly describe the visit as suspicious. That distinction matters. Questions from journalists are not the same as conclusions from investigators. Brian Entin's reporting has often focused on asking questions that viewers themselves are asking. Rather than presenting speculation as fact, he frequently highlights unanswered issues and seeks responses from those connected to high-profile cases. In this situation, his questions centered less on making accusations and more on understanding the circumstances. Why that location? Why then? Had investigators already looked into it? Were there explanations the public simply had not heard? Those are legitimate questions for any reporter covering an ongoing case. But they are still questions, not answers. As interest grew, social media transformed the cemetery visit into something much larger than it originally appeared. Some users claimed it proved hidden knowledge. Others suggested investigators had overlooked an important clue. Several videos offered dramatic interpretations without presenting verifiable evidence. That pattern has become increasingly common in modern true crime coverage. One photograph can spread across thousands of accounts within hours. A short video clip can be viewed millions of times. Each repost often adds another layer of interpretation until many people forget what was actually confirmed. For families involved in missing person cases, that can become overwhelming. Every movement is examined. Every expression is analyzed. Every public appearance becomes another topic of debate. Witnesses said that attention surrounding Nancy's disappearance affected many people connected to the investigation. Not only investigators themselves, but also relatives, friends, and members of the surrounding community. Living under that level of public scrutiny is something very few people ever experience. Still, questions remained, and they did not disappear. Instead, they continued growing. That would have been the end of it. But another detail stood out. Several observers noticed that discussions about the cemetery visit often appeared alongside renewed interest in the broader timeline of Nancy's disappearance. People began asking whether events that once seemed unrelated might actually fit together. Investigators, however, generally approach cases differently. Rather than beginning with assumptions, detectives typically build a timeline piece by piece. Where was each person? Who saw them? When did those sightings occur? Which facts can be independently verified? Which statements are supported by physical evidence? Those questions guide investigations far more than internet theories. Records show that timelines often change as new information emerges. A witness may remember an important detail weeks later. Digital records may confirm or contradict earlier accounts. Surveillance footage sometimes appears long after an initial search. Each new piece must be compared against everything investigators already know. That process takes time, sometimes much more time than the public expects. Brian Entin has repeatedly emphasized during coverage of other major cases that patience often matters more than speed. Reporters may learn information that cannot yet be confirmed. Detectives may possess evidence they choose not to release publicly. As frustrating as that can be for viewers, it is often intended to protect the integrity of an investigation. That is why unanswered questions should not automatically be interpreted as hidden evidence. Sometimes they simply remain unanswered. Even so, certain moments continue capturing public attention. The cemetery visit became one of them. Some people focused on Annie herself. Others focused on the location. Graveyards carry emotional weight unlike almost any other place. Old headstones tell family histories. Fresh flowers reveal recent loss. Quiet pathways encourage reflection. When someone connected to a nationally discussed case appears there, many people naturally wonder whether the visit has deeper meaning. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. Without verified evidence, both possibilities remain exactly that, possibilities. According to available reporting, investigators have not publicly identified the cemetery visit as a turning point in the case. Nor have they released evidence showing that the location itself changed the direction of their investigation. That leaves observers with an uncomfortable reality. The story surrounding the graveyard may be important, or it may simply reflect how easily ordinary events become extraordinary once they are placed under the spotlight of a nationally followed investigation. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of the discussion fading away, renewed media coverage brought fresh attention to old questions. People returned to photographs. They revisited interviews. They compared statements made months apart. And once again, Brian Entin asked viewers to think carefully about what was known, what was assumed, and what still remained uncertain. That distinction may ultimately prove more important than any single photograph or social media post, because in cases like this, the smallest detail can either illuminate the truth or distract everyone from it. And as more people began looking beyond the cemetery itself, another part of the timeline started drawing renewed attention. It involved not only where Annie was, but who else was accounted for during those same critical periods, and whether those timelines truly match the evidence investigators have discussed publicly. That is where the story becomes even more complicated. When investigators examine a case that has drawn widespread attention, they rarely focus on a single moment in isolation. Instead, they build a picture one piece at a time: a phone call, a receipt, a surveillance image, a witness interview, a digital record. Individually, those pieces may seem ordinary. Together, they can either support a timeline or reveal that something does not quite fit. That brings us back to the questions surrounding Annie Guthrie's visit to the graveyard. By itself, the visit does not establish guilt, innocence, or involvement in a crime. Publicly available information has not shown that investigators identified the cemetery as a crime scene or announced that Annie's presence there was evidence of wrongdoing. Even so, The visit became part of the larger conversation because of its timing and because people naturally tried to understand whether it connected to anything else that had already been reported. Brian Entin's approach reflected that same curiosity. Rather than telling viewers what to believe, he raised questions that many people had already been asking. Was there context that had not yet been made public? Had investigators quietly looked into the visit? Was there a personal explanation that simply had not been shared? Those are reasonable questions. The challenge is that reasonable questions do not always have immediate answers. As weeks turned into months, people revisited the timeline repeatedly. Some compared media interviews given at different points in the investigation. Others looked back at public appeals made by family members. Still others examined court records and official statements that became available over time. One thing became clear. The timeline itself remained the foundation of the investigation. Detectives generally begin by asking where each known person was during critical periods. They compare those accounts with physical evidence whenever possible. Cell phone records, financial transactions, security camera footage, vehicle movements, and witness statements all become pieces of the same puzzle. Sometimes those pieces fit together neatly, sometimes they do not. When inconsistencies appear, investigators do not necessarily assume deception. Memory can be imperfect, especially during stressful situations. People often remember events differently after days or weeks have passed. That is why detectives rely on documentation whenever it is available. According to investigators in many major missing person cases, corroborating evidence is often more reliable than memory alone. That principle applies here as well. Throughout public discussion of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, numerous online commentators claimed they had identified contradictions. Some pointed to interviews. Others highlighted social media activity. A few attempted to reconstruct movements using publicly available photographs. The difficulty is that outside observers rarely possess the complete investigative file. Authorities may have interviews the public has never seen. They may have forensic results that remain sealed. They may know why certain leads were dismissed without ever announcing those reasons publicly. That can make speculation appear more convincing than it really is. One widely discussed issue involved timing. People asked exactly when Annie visited the cemetery. Was it before a particular investigative development? After new information became public? Close to an anniversary? Connected to a family remembrance? Without confirmed official details explaining the purpose of the visit, those questions remained open. And open questions often attract even more attention than answered ones. Then another pattern emerged. People began focusing less on the graveyard itself and more on the emotional impact of the visit. Grief affects everyone differently. Some people seek company. Others withdraw into quiet places. Many visit cemeteries simply because they provide space for reflection, away from cameras and public attention. Those possibilities should always be considered before assigning meaning to someone's actions. That is particularly important in cases followed by millions of people. A photograph captures only a single moment. It does not reveal what happened before or after. It cannot explain conversations that took place outside the camera's view, nor can it reveal a person's thoughts. Those limits are easy to forget once an image spreads across television broadcasts and social media platforms. Brian Entin has frequently reminded viewers during other investigations that photographs often tell only part of the story. Context matters, dates matter, locations matter. Most importantly, verified facts matter. Without them, assumptions can quickly become accepted as truth. That creates challenges not only for journalists, but also for investigators. Every rumor requires time to evaluate. Every widely shared claim may generate new tips from the public. Some tips prove valuable, others consume investigative resources without producing useful evidence. Law enforcement agencies have repeatedly noted in unrelated cases that high-profile investigations can receive thousands of public submissions. While many come from well-intentioned people, only a small percentage ultimately contribute meaningful evidence. Even so, investigators cannot simply ignore them. Each credible lead deserves attention. That process is often slow. It rarely unfolds the way television dramas suggest. Real investigations involve paperwork, interviews, laboratory analysis, and careful verification. Progress may occur quietly for weeks before becoming visible to the public. Meanwhile, viewers continue asking questions. One question that kept resurfacing was whether the cemetery visit represented an attempt to communicate something without saying it directly. There is no publicly verified evidence supporting that idea. Nevertheless, it became a recurring topic across online discussions. Psychologists who study public reactions to true crime stories have long observed that people naturally search for hidden meaning during periods of uncertainty. When answers are limited, ordinary actions can appear unusually significant. That tendency does not mean those interpretations are correct. It simply reflects how the human mind responds to unanswered questions. Another detail added to the discussion. Several observers noticed differences between early reporting and later commentary. That is not unusual. News coverage evolves as additional information becomes available. Early reports often rely on preliminary facts. Later reporting may include interviews, documents, or investigative developments that were unavailable at the beginning. As a result, what appears inconsistent may simply reflect the normal progression of reporting. Brian Entin's continued interest in the case illustrated that process. Rather than revisiting the story only once, he continued examining developments as they occurred. Each new interview or official update provided another opportunity to ask whether earlier assumptions still held up. Sometimes they did, sometimes they did not. That careful approach is one reason many viewers continue following experienced investigative reporters during complex cases. Questions are valuable. Conclusions require evidence. There is an important difference between the two. Then something else began drawing attention. People looked beyond Annie's actions and started examining the broader environment surrounding the investigation. Search locations, witness interviews, the sequence of official announcements, the timing of public appeals. Each element became part of a larger effort to understand not only what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but also how investigators attempted to solve the mystery. Records show that missing person investigations often change direction several times. An early theory may appear promising before evidence points elsewhere. A witness once considered unimportant may later become central. A seemingly minor detail may gain significance only after additional evidence emerges. Because of that, investigators rarely judge a case based on one isolated event. They examine patterns, relationships, timelines, physical evidence, independent verification. That methodical process may not satisfy public curiosity immediately, but it is designed to produce reliable conclusions rather than quick ones. As discussion continued, one reality became increasingly clear. The graveyard visit had become symbolic. For some people, it represented unanswered questions. For others, it demonstrated how easily speculation can outpace evidence. Both reactions reflected the uncertainty that still surrounded the larger case. And uncertainty has a way of keeping stories alive long after headlines fade. By the time renewed media attention brought the cemetery visit back into focus, many viewers had begun asking an even broader question. If so much attention had centered on one photograph and one location, what other parts of the investigation deserved another careful look? That question would eventually lead reporters, investigators, and the public back to evidence that had received far less attention than the graveyard itself. Evidence that, according to records and later reporting, may provide a clearer understanding of how the investigation unfolded than any single image ever could. By the time the discussion surrounding the cemetery visit had spread across news reports, social media, and countless online videos, one important fact remained unchanged. There was still no public confirmation that the visit itself played a decisive role in the investigation. That can be frustrating for anyone following a case closely. When a single image captures public attention, it is tempting to believe it contains the missing piece. But experienced investigators know that real answers rarely come from one photograph or one isolated event. They come from evidence that can be tested and verified. That brings us to the biggest lesson in this story. The questions Brian Entin raised were never presented as answers. They were invitations to look more carefully at the available information instead of accepting speculation at face value. Throughout his reporting on major criminal investigations, Entin has consistently emphasized the importance of separating confirmed facts from assumptions. In this case, the same principle applies. We know that Nancy Guthrie's disappearance generated intense public interest. We know investigators conducted interviews, examined evidence, and continued building their timeline. We know that Annie Guthrie's visit to a cemetery became a widely discussed topic. What we do not know, based on publicly available information, is that the cemetery visit has been identified by investigators as proof of criminal conduct or as a turning point in the case. That distinction matters. Cases involving missing persons often unfold over months or even years. During that time, investigators may uncover information that never becomes public until charges are filed, or, in some situations, never becomes public at all. Many investigative files contain interviews that remain sealed. Laboratory reports may never be released. Witness identities are sometimes protected. Certain evidence may be withheld specifically to preserve the integrity of future proceedings. Because of that, members of the public rarely see the complete picture while an investigation is active. It is a reminder that silence does not necessarily mean inaction. Sometimes it simply means investigators are continuing their work away from the cameras. For families connected to these cases, that waiting can be especially difficult. Every update raises hope. Every delay creates new uncertainty. Every news report is watched closely, not only by strangers interested in the mystery, but also by people whose lives have been changed forever. That emotional reality is easy to overlook. The public often focuses on the investigation. Families are living through it. That difference cannot be overstated. The cemetery itself also deserves a different perspective. Places like that naturally carry emotional significance. People visit to remember parents, grandparents, spouses, siblings, lifelong friends, or children. Some visits are planned months in advance. Others happen unexpectedly after a difficult day. Without knowing the personal reasons behind someone's visit, assigning hidden meaning becomes risky. That is one reason responsible reporting continues returning to verified facts. Evidence first, interpretation second. As the months passed, attention surrounding the graveyard gradually became part of the larger history of the case, rather than its defining feature. Investigators continued examining evidence. Journalists continued asking questions. Members of the public continued searching for answers. But no single photograph resolved the mystery. If anything, the discussion illustrated how modern investigations unfold in an era of instant communication. Years ago, a private visit to a cemetery might have gone unnoticed. Today, one photograph can travel across the country within minutes. Thousands of people can examine it. Millions can comment on it. Some discussions remain thoughtful. Others move far beyond what the evidence supports. That is one of the biggest challenges facing both investigators and journalists today. Information moves faster than verification. Brian Entin's questions reflected that reality. Rather than claiming certainty, he encouraged viewers to think critically. What is confirmed? What remains unclear? What evidence actually exists? Those questions are just as important as the mystery itself. They help prevent assumptions from replacing facts. Looking back, the graveyard visit tells us less about what happened to Nancy Guthrie than it does about how people respond to uncertainty. When answers are limited, every detail seems significant. Every expression is analyzed. Every movement is examined. Every location becomes part of the conversation. Sometimes those observations uncover meaningful leads. Sometimes they simply remind us how easily ordinary events can become extraordinary when viewed through the lens of an unsolved investigation. The search for truth requires patience. It also requires discipline. Investigators cannot rely on rumors. Journalists cannot rely on assumptions. Viewers should be careful not to confuse unanswered questions with confirmed evidence. That may not provide the dramatic conclusion many people hope for. But it is how responsible investigations move forward. As of the latest publicly available information, the questions surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance continue to generate public interest, while many aspects of the case remain matters of ongoing discussion or have not been fully explained publicly. Where official information is limited, it is important to recognize those limits, rather than filling the gaps with speculation. In many ways, that is what makes stories like this so compelling. They remind us that the pursuit of truth is often slower than the spread of headlines. The strongest evidence is not always the loudest, and sometimes, the most important question is not whether a photograph looks suspicious, but whether the facts actually support the conclusions people draw from it. What do you think? Do you believe the attention given to Annie Guthrie's cemetery visit has been justified based on the publicly known facts? Or do you think it became a much bigger story than the available evidence supports? Share your thoughts in the comments, but remember to keep the discussion respectful and grounded in verified information. If you enjoy thoughtful, fact-focused coverage of developing cases without rushing to conclusions, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you carefully researched stories that separate confirmed reporting from speculation. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.